speaker is a very well-known open data activist. He is retained by many governments to help advise them on their open data and open government policies. Last year he spoke, and it was a very powerful and memorable talk. And this year he would like to continue that discussion with us today. So please welcome to the stage David Eves.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I actually have two talks that I'm going to give. A short one, I just want to talk briefly about why visualizations matter. It's particularly important for the sales team here at Socrata to understand how visualizations matter. So I have a visualization here I want to share. This is a shuffleboard. Some people are confused about what the data on the shuffleboard reveals. What it actually reveals is that red has won this game, for those who are confused. Sometimes people think it's the most things that are close. No, it's actually the one that's closest to the end that actually wins. And if in case you're really confused, because it sometimes is confusing, this is how the data gets divided. It's a very binary situation with those on the left winning, or my left winning, yeah, and everyone's left winning, and those on the right. They do not count. None of those actually count, in case there was confusion. So this would actually result in 3 points. Or actually 5 points, 3 plus 2, because one's in the 3, but none of the other ones count. It's just an illustration I wanted to make of why actually just talking about something is not nearly as useful as laying out a series of photos with some visualizations. Some key questions I want to just make sure everybody in the audience is asking themselves whenever they're thinking about data visualizations, especially as it results to playing this particular game is, is the board salted sufficiently? What is a rock? Because if you don't know, you're probably not Canadian. And then, is David on my team? That's a definite must-have. And then, what terrible life decisions have I made to bring me to this point where I'm playing shuffleboard in a bar against a Canadian at the Socrata conference? That ends the first presentation I wanted to make. The sales team can thank me later. They really struggled with a lot of that last night, so I thought it was important for them to understand. And I wanted to explain it in a language that they would get. So I gave a talk last year that I'm going to talk a little bit about, and I wanted to come back and share kind of what I have been learning walking around and meeting with lots of different IT directors and kind of advising several different governments and just kind of doing some of the work. I haven't blogged or written in a while, and part of that's because I started a company and it's just taken over my life, so I haven't had time to write, but I've actually been thinking a lot about this stuff, and I've learned stuff doing Recollect, and I've learned stuff consulting and advising, and I kind of wanted to share some of those things. For those who don't know me, I really there's three things that it's kind of hard to talk about what I do because I do too much, but really I have three buckets in my life. So one's around open data and kind of innovation. The other's around, I'm a huge government policy geek. Like it's the most important institution. I care so much about it. But my original career is actually as a negotiation consultant and strategist. And so everything I do kind of falls into one of these three buckets and often into kind of like two of them. So I end up I've done a lot of the training for the code. I've trained every batch of the Code for America fellows. I've done training for almost all of the presidential innovation fellows at the White House. I'm about to start teaching at the Kennedy School. This slide is merely designed to make you think that I'm smart. So let's move on. I actually helped also pass I wrote the motion that created the Open Data Portal in Vancouver, which was the second city after Washington, D.C. To do an open data portal kind of in the modern era. And then pressured the federal government in Canada to do open data at a time when they were very opposed. Now they're very in favor, by crowdsourcing all of the open data sets that actually existed across all the federal ministry websites and bringing them to one place and telling them you're actually already doing open data even though you say you can't. Here's where they're all located. Here's a portal that you could just take if you'd like, long before Socrata existed. And then I started a company called Recollect, and we work with several hundred cities across North America. We kind of do a CMS for solid waste and recycling. There's a lot more, but that's not why I'm here. So kind of the story so far is last year I gave this talk, as was mentioned, about open data's disruptive potential, and I'm going to summarize that talk in 5 slides. So first, there was a guy called Nixon, and he did all sorts of bad things. That allowed a whole bunch of progressives to come together and say we need to change the way that we access information from government, and it led to the passage of the Access Information Act. The whole reason why the Access to Information Act was even possible was because this device had been invented, which was the photocopier. If you didn't have photocopiers, how in the heck were you going to actually distribute all of the documents that were being accessed? And the big problem is people think that ATIP legislation or FOI legislation is kind of technology agnostic, but it's not. In fact, it's built on, this is the technology stack of FOI legislation. And shockingly, that technology stack hasn't changed all that much. So, we used to do things on typewriters and then we'd file them. Now we do them on printers. Now we do them on computers and they end up in systems, but we actually still end up printing them out and sending them around by and large. And the big structural mistake that I think that we have made so far in open data, and a lot of this conferences try to talk about how to get around that, is that we were sticking the open data portal at the top of the stack, merely replacing the photocopier with your Socrata portal. So we were kind of like the new, better photocopier. And it so misses the mark about what we are actually about and the potential and the transformative potential that we have. And so my argument has been that open data portals actually live in the wrong part of your stack. They don't live at the bottom. They need to be living at the bottom. And all of your applications should be built on top of your open data portals. And that all of the analysis done internally should be drawing data from your open data portals. And that if you do that, you'll have internal use that will actually justify the existence of your data programs. And if you are simply relying on external use to validate you, you're going to be hooped, because it's going to take a long time to get sufficiently dense enough and interesting enough to deem that there is an ROI. And in fact, there may never be an ROI that's clear enough to clear all of the political hurdles to continuous survival. Whereas I think the ROI for internal use can become very clear very quickly. So that was the talk I gave last year. I think even if you do all that, we still have a bunch of other problems that we're starting to wrestle with. And what I wanted to focus on there is that I wanted to focus on the role of the IT director, because it ain't easy being the director of IT. You don't have enough time. Everybody wants some of your time, and you don't have enough of it to go around. You're always the person who says no. It's challenging, and you've got all of these traditional IT functions that you're supposed to be doing, keeping the servers up, like kind of doing all this stuff. I kind of actually talk about like the NATO version of the IT director. So I'm an international relations guy, and so we used to talk about NATO as like, NATO is designed to keep the Americans in, the Germans down, and the Russians out. And I feel like traditional IT's goal is like to keep the servers up and the vendors down and the bad guys out. And that's all we really ask of them. It's like, just do those things. But increasingly, the expectations around IT are just inflating and inflating and inflating. There's so many people who want to be doing things. And those things range from there's internal and external, but there's analytics, there's usability, there's mobile. There's why are we not thinking about the user more? I want to do this cool little thing over here, and all you're doing is saying no. Why can't we buy this thing? Can we go to the cloud? It's just like the expectations around the poor IT guy are just exploding. And I think what's even more challenging is that it's going to get worse. We're just at the beginning of what I think is a complete transformation in municipal IT and the role that it plays in the city. And for a great example of how I think it's going to get worse, this is an important newspaper there's a great title, Why Software is Eating the World, and there's a guy, Mark Andreessen, who might know a thing or two about technology and computers and the internet. And he wrote this article, which if you've not read, you should go Google this. It's a fantastic article about how software is eating the world, because his argument is, he's like, I'm going to keep investing in technology because technology is no longer about software. He's like, software is infecting everything in the world, from airplanes that are flying to financial systems to everything now has a piece of software that's helping design, build, or maintain it. And therefore, software is eating all the things that we do and all of the services that we have. So everything now is a software problem. So if we thought that we were coming to the end of kind of the big Silicon Valley world of startups, he's like, actually, we're just coming into the beginning of this, because there's so many, the obvious stuff's been taken, but now all this non-obvious stuff, which there's a lot more, is now all going to get eaten up by software. And I think that kind of makes the broader point that today IT touches everything. There's not a service that I can think of off the top of my head that a city offers that at some point doesn't touch something in the IT stack at the municipal level. I can't think of what it is. I'm sure there's something, but they're dwindling in number if they exist. And even this has been like anybody who's been in the municipal space for many years now knows that this has actually been a slow burning phenomenon that's been creeping up on us. Like you think back 20, 30 years to GIS, this was like the first, I think like the first part where software started to kind of eat some interesting things. We were gonna map the city, and the map of the city is actually, we are actually able now to do the anatomy of the city for the first time. So GIS opened up this whole new world, and there was all this promise, and the promise was always a little bit delayed, but it has slowly been coming together that now we know what the body of a city looks like, and it has changed the way people think about how they manage cities. I even remember when I was in university, I went to visit a friend at UVic. I was interviewing people for my thesis, and he was in GIS with his friend, and he was like, oh yeah, he's like, my buddy had a summer internship at a city near where I lived, and he basically mapped all of the water mains in the GIS system by hand, or some crazy system he had to use. And we discovered that basically there were 2,000 homes in the city connected to the water system and the sewage system that the city didn't realize. And all of a sudden, like the city manager, like his boss, the GIS manager, was basically like, I don't really care what you do with your internship for the rest of the summer, because you have just earned your keep like 9 times over as an annuity for us, because we're now charging taxes to all those people that we previously weren't. And it was, for me, I was like, oh wow, the map of the city is changing the way that we actually interact with people, and it's changing the way we track things. And then the other big trend that I think we're seeing is in 311, which I actually think is the nervous system of the city. It basically turns anyone with a mobile device and any citizen, and certainly any employee of the city, into a nerve ending of that city that can report pain or problems, and occasionally also report joy, but more often they report pain or problems. And that has changed the way that we can actually analyze and see what's going on in a city, that we can see the kind of the life beat of a city. This is a fairly old visualization that Stephen B. Johnson did of every 311 request to New York over a 24-hour period, mapped to 24-hour period over the course of a year. So the pink is noise complaints. You can see they're big at night and they shrink because everybody expects it to be noisy in New York in the middle of the day, and then they get big again at night because people are trying to go to sleep. And what I think is particularly interesting about these two systems is they've slowly eaten more and more of kind of what a city does, and the different types of reporting issues that the city has are kind of slowly gobbling them up, is that we really managed to take the anatomy, the map of the city, and we've paired it with the nervous system. So we actually have kind of something closer to a living organism that we can understand, and software is enabling all that. And then on top of it gets built on that is like all sorts of new systems that allow us to do that even more easily and more cheaply. This is a C-click-fix implementation in a small town in Alberta, which could never have afforded any of this stuff, even 15 years ago. And now for this used to be like a 6x problem. Now it's like a 10x problem in terms of money, and it's really changed the way citizens and people can understand what's going on in their city, including mapping of zones and understanding like what nerves are screaming in that particular box on any given day in a city. That's just what's happened in the last 20 years, and that's actually, I would consider, the slow burn part of what we're going into, not even the fast burn part that I think we're getting into, because every single day, like thousands of new things are getting connected both to an electronic device and then in turn also to the internet. And again, every single one of your employees or every single person who works in the city is now functionally connected to the internet at some point through their device, and probably through the truck that they're driving, through the terminal that they're using, through the phone, even the landline they're using. They are now connected, and it's providing us with more data, but also more software and more services and more systems that the poor IT director has to take care of and understand what's going on. So we have this incredible increase in expectations that I think is creating a whole bunch of new challenges. And I think the IT directors are in trouble, is the short answer, because I don't think we're ready for this world. I want to talk about some specific examples in which I think illustrate why we're in trouble. The first is, there's a whole bunch of wonderful examples of analytics that people have done to find savings or improve services in their cities. Most powerfully, almost everyone in this room has heard of these stories, but the great work that was done in New York around redeploying the fire inspectors to better identify what were the buildings that were actually at risk, that saves firemen lives and increase the the number of times that a citation was made from 20% to 80% of visits, so really leveraging the resource more effectively. Again, with the grease, locating where people were illegally dumping grease and then getting those people to actually give that grease to biofuel manufacturers. And then the response time for ambulance, redistributing the ambulances to so they'd be located next to 24-hour coffee joints when they were not going anywhere. By doing that, they reduced, I think, the wait times for an ambulance to get to a patient by 90 seconds, which actually has a big impact on people's lives. All of this was done by simply doing some anthropological work of following these workers around and understanding how they did their job, and then matching that with a whole bunch of data about how we could be more intelligent about how we deploy these resources. This is like a wonderful story about what we're doing. And it's creating all sorts of new demand. All sorts of politicians are saying, oh, we should be doing what New York does in our city. And this clearly involves data, and data is technology. And so therefore, my IT director should be doing this. And most IT directors kind of go, man, like, I'm not a quant. Like, that's not my world, but that's currently where we're going. Like, all open data programs first end up on the desk of the IT director. Whether or not the IT director is the right place for it to land, it's technology, so it belongs there. Boom, that's where we're going to put it. And I'd really push you to say, like, is there anything about data analytics that has anything to do with IT whatsoever? Anything. Other than the fact that it sits in an Excel spreadsheet, which happens to sit on a server. But like, that's true of every other service, but somehow this ended up on the desk of the IT director. And I think that's made all the more challenging because if the IT director is not strategic and is not putting Socrates at the bottom of the stack, then they're in trouble as well. But why in the heck are they kind of the ones responsible for thinking about what's going to happen to the data and for organizing and rallying people around that? Just as a brief sidebar, if you are thinking about doing what New York did, the best thing that I've seen so far in the cities that I've looked at is like make sure that you have backing from like a very, very senior person in the public service who's got a very, very big stick, ideally the mayor or the deputy mayor or the chief of staff of the city or the city manager. Get a very, very small team with some quant skills, but even the guys in New York, they just had people straight out of graduate school. But you need to have great soft skills. You have to have one person, like Michael Flowers, great soft skills. That man knew how to go into a department and like say, hey, I'm going to help you guys. The quant schools were almost secondary. He certainly did not have any. And then he shared the wins. So he always shared the wins. And he's always started with a question, not with the data. That was never like, what data do we have? Let's do what we can do. It was, how do we save firemen's lives? How do we reduce ambulance times? Those are the questions they started with. And then they followed that and they found data that helped answer it. They didn't start with the data. That's a brief sidebar. Example 2 about how IT directors' lives, I think, are getting more challenging. I have a terrible story. So I serve as a vendor, and we have legal contracts, and we have legal agreements, and there's like user terms that even the end users of our software need to use. And we try to keep ours really simple. We were negotiating with a city, and they said, we have some user terms that we want to put in front of the residents before they use your service. And we were like, okay, great, send them over. And it was like literally like this. And this is in a community in which like half the people don't have English as a first language. And so all we did was we just put some paragraph markers in the thing and spaced it out. And we reordered 2 sentences because we thought it would read better. And we got on the phone with them, and the people there, the IT people, were like, we can't do anything about this. We're not going to do this contract with you if you insist on these changes because we don't know what legal is going to say. And it'll take weeks for them to decide. And what's glaring to me is that in that moment, like we were pushing really hard, that the only person pushing to think on behalf of the user was the vendor, not the city. And that even we caved because like we're not going to say no to the deal because the city won't do it. And so there's no one there who's actually thinking about, the IT director doesn't have time to think always about the user. That's not necessarily like what the senior guy can be doing. And what we saw very quickly is like the order of like what we were thinking about is compliance, and then maybe the goals of what we're trying to do, and then the user is very, very last. That's actually the sequence that often ends up being real in an IT department because, again, we don't have time to be thinking about this stuff. And if my job has been about keeping the servers up and keeping the Chinese out and keeping the mail flowing, then that's all I've ever had to worry about. And even here is like, do you have a single product manager who reports to you on your city staff? What I always find amazing is that everything in the city is organized on a project basis. So we start a project, we code it up, we finish that project, and then it's done, and then it goes out there, and then like we basically do maintenance on it for the next 10 years. But actually, like the city doesn't have projects. The city has products. And the citizens use those products every single day. And it's very rare. I have yet to actually stumble upon the city that has a product manager whose job is to be constantly thinking about what the user experience of that product is in the hands of the citizens themselves, rather than a project whose budget comes up every once in a while and needs to be renewed. Again, not because the IT managers can't do that, but they're not incented to, and they've got too many other things that they've got to be worried about. And this is not the way we've historically thought about this problem. And maybe the worst example is thinking about the lack of product managers is then like the sloppy thinking that can get in. So like then we start thinking about, oh, well, the politicians think, our website's good, so we should have a one city app. And the one city app is like a terrible, terrible trap because you have like Google level UX challenges on your hands. We think it's citizen centric, but it's actually completely not. If you look at like a city's website, this is City of Vancouver's website, my hometown at the moment. It's a great website, but like look at all of the different calls to action on that website. And this is on a giant screen. And so if you look at the city's website, you've got hundreds of services from probably over 50 vendors, and you're going to magically transform that onto a screen that is like 1/100th or like 1/10 the size that offers equal number of services with only a single vendor. This is like total fantasy that we're going to be able to make this happen in any way that makes sense. But again, we don't get the pushback. We don't have the strategic thinking around it. We're not doing that right now because we're not being asked. And even the major companies don't even think this way. So Facebook, when you're in Facebook and you open Messenger, it's not an app within Facebook. It's a separate app that gets loaded up. Instagram's never been folded into Facebook. Google, there's not one Google app. There's a whole plethora of apps that are out there. And even Microsoft, which started off with doing one app for Office, quickly discovered that was way too painful and said, no, we got to be able to hand people off between apps, because then you can fire one app and bring in another app. And very few cities do this, what I call constellation strategy, effectively. Calgary, I think, does well, where they own the branding around all of the apps, and the apps pass users off between them, and the user can actually download just the ones they care about, and the city can fire the ones they don't like and replace them with a new vendor, and it doesn't shake up the whole ecosystem for them. And it also allows for things like 3-in-1 to be in every single app. I think 3-in-1 should be in every app. It shouldn't be a standalone app. I mean, it should be a standalone app, but it should also be in every single app. And that's all made more possible, again, if your open data portal is at the bottom of the stack, because then it can be powering all those apps, and you have the freedom of bringing somebody in, touching an API, making that app work, and then firing them and kicking them off and bringing a new person in. That's all done way, way more easily if you're here. But if you're not here, then having a single vendor becomes the simple thing to do, and I think the lazy thing to do. So the bigger problem that I'm trying to articulate here is I think the next problem we're facing is that there's really just a big gap between what I think is digital versus IT, and that actually the city is becoming digital, and we are still thinking in terms of IT. And that when you think about what digital means, it's like, actually, what is the strategy for how we're going to deliver services online? How are we going to meet user needs wherever they are? How are we going to be doing analytics across all the things that we do? How are we going to be managing our products? There's like a whole bunch of strategic conversations that need to start to be happening. And IT is much more about like, how are we going to do support? How are we going to develop? How are we going to do project management? How are we going to keep the servers up? How are we going to keep the bad guys out? All those types of things. And this gap between the traditional IT function and the expectations we have around it, I think, is largely explained by the fact that actually everything's now digital, and our IT people are being asked to do way more than I think they've been structurally positioned to do. And that this is going to take a whole bunch of new skills and a broader role and a much bigger strategic view about what we're doing. And this is not an indictment of the people who serve as IT directors. This is an indictment of the structure that we have put them in. And the litmus test for this is do you or does your director of IT report to the CFO? If the director of IT reports to the CFO, which is true, I've done like a broad test of this. I've asked around, and I'd say about 60% of the time it's true, but another 20% of the time it's to somebody else. If they report to the CFO, think about what that says about IT. They're a cost center. They're to be controlled, and they're certainly not strategic, because it means when the CAO is having their meeting, and again, let's remember, in an era where every single service touches technology at this point, there is nobody at the senior management table who can articulate what the strategic vision for technology should be for the city. This completely blows my mind. And the person who's actually positioned to articulate that is the chief financial officer, who has got a lot of other things they need to be worried about and is probably not all that well equipped to talk about these things. And how many people actually report to the CAO or the city manager directly? And it's an incredibly small number of people who do that. It helps a little bit in the strong mayor system, where strong mayors, I think, are increasingly doing this, but it's it's not that many people. And so I think the thing that we've got to be doing is we've got to take our IT directors and we've got to say to them, you need to be demanding a bigger role. You have a more significant role to play. And if you don't ask for it, it's not going to magically get thrust upon us. All that's going to happen is the demands upon you are going to get heaped up, and they're going to become bigger and bigger and bigger, and you are going to be structurally constrained about your ability to respond to them. And everybody else is going to start running off and doing their own thing because they're not going to be able to feel like they can rely on IT to do it. You actually have to go out and grab the power. And if you aren't willing to grab the power, then you have to make room for the person who is going to do digital in the city and figure out how you're going to work with that person to support them and how they're going to support you, and you're going to be a team. But this isn't going to magically solve itself. And so part of that is like, are you demanding to be at the CAO's table? But it's also, what are all the other skills that we need to build within our people and kind of within the system to help equip the chief technology, or so the director of IT, to become a true CIO and serve the city in that way. So I think, like, for me, I don't have great answers for you on this front. I'm a little bit in a conundrum as I walk around and I talk to people. But I think we're asking our IT directors to be more than they're currently equipped to be. And I'm really open to pushback and for people to tell me that I'm wrong. But I want everybody in this room who's involved in kind of data and thinking about these things, if you're in IT, like, understand that IT is changing. Are you thinking about IT, or are you thinking about digital? Like, are you thinking about the big picture, or are you thinking about the smaller problem? And are you ready to evolve, and or are you able to enable and support the people who are going to be doing digital and build the skills to do that? That is my tough conversation about what I think is going on in corporate IT right now. And I think it doesn't really matter if we put Socrata at the bottom of the stack or the top of the stack, because the next thing that we need to be doing is if we put it at the top of the stack, it's going to fail. If we put it at the bottom of the stack but we don't solve these things, I think we're still not positioning ourselves for the revolution in municipal IT and in government technology that I think awaits us, and it has a huge amount of promise. So thank you guys so much for inviting me.